The storm swallowed the highway as a retired Navy SEAL noticed what others ignored. A mother German shepherd stood in the road, not barking, but silently pleading for help. Cars rushed past without slowing, until one man felt something deeper than reason and chose to stop. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Your city, your state, or your country. We'd love to see how far this story travels. At the edge of winter, when the sky seemed to hang low and heavy over the endless stretch of highway in rural Colorado, the world felt quieter than it should have been, as if something had been taken from it and never returned, and along that long white road, where snow had buried the lines that once guided direction. A single truck moved steadily forward, its tires pressing into the frozen surface with a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed the man behind the wheel. Thomas Reed was 62 years old, a retired Navy SEAL whose body still carried the strength of discipline, but whose eyes had long since lost the urgency of purpose. His face was sharply defined, weathered by years of harsh environments and harder decisions. His short gray hair and neatly trimmed beard gave him the appearance of someone who once lived by strict rules, but the slight sag in his shoulders revealed a man who no longer felt bound to any mission. He wore a thick winter jacket, practical and unremarkable, the kind of clothing chosen not for style, but for survival. And as he drove through the snow-covered highway, his hands remained steady on the wheel, though his mind wandered in places he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Thomas had once been the kind of man who responded before hesitation could take root, a man who moved toward danger when others stepped back, but that version of him had begun to fade. The day Margaret died, Margaret Reed had been his wife for over 30 years, a woman with soft brown hair, kind eyes, and a quiet strength that had anchored him through the chaos of his past. She had not been loud or commanding, but there was something in the way she listened, the way she understood without needing explanation, that had given Thomas a sense of home no place ever could. When she passed, the house they had shared did not feel empty in the way most people described. It felt distant, like something he no longer belonged to, and over time, Thomas adapted, not by healing, but by narrowing his world. He spoke less, went out only when necessary, and learned to move through his days without expecting anything from them. Which was why, as he drove that afternoon through a storm that most would have avoided, he did not question why he was out there at all. It was simply another stretch of time to get through, another quiet passage between one day and the next. The wind pushed against the truck in uneven bursts, carrying snow across the road in shifting patterns that blurred the distance ahead. Visibility was poor, but Thomas did not slow down, not out of recklessness, but because he trusted his instincts more than the conditions. Years of training had taught him how to read movement, how to anticipate the unseen. And yet, even with that awareness, there were things no training could prepare a man for. Something moved ahead of him, faint at first, almost lost in the swirl of white. And Thomas narrowed his eyes, adjusting his focus. The shape did not behave like the wind, it held form, it resisted. And as he drew closer, the outline became clearer. A figure standing in the middle of the road, small compared to the vastness around it, but unmoving in a way that demanded attention. His foot eased onto the brake. Not suddenly, but with controlled pressure. The truck slowed as the figure resolved into something unmistakable. A dog, a German shepherd, her coat dark beneath layers of snow, her body lean but strong, her ears partially lowered, not in aggression, but in something closer to uncertainty. She stood directly in his path, not darting away as most animals would, not reacting to the sound of the engine or the approaching mass of metal, and that alone was enough to tell Thomas that something was wrong. He brought the truck to a full stop several yards away, the engine idling, the wind howling louder now that the motion had ceased, and for a moment neither of them moved. The dog looked straight at him, her eyes steady, not wild, not panicked, but focused in a way that unsettled him more than fear ever could. There was intention there, something deliberate, and Thomas felt a familiar tension rise in his chest, the kind he had not felt in years, not the rush of combat, but the quiet alertness that came before a decision. He should have kept driving. That was the logical choice, the safe one. The version of himself that had learned to avoid involvement would have done exactly that. But something held him in place, something that did not align with logic. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging faintly in the cold air inside the cab, and for the first time in a long while, he hesitated, not because he was unsure, but because he recognized the weight of what he was about to do. Outside, the dog shifted slightly, her paws pressing deeper into the snow, and then, instead of stepping back or running, she turned her head, just slightly, as if checking something behind her before looking back at him again. And in that small, almost imperceptible movement, Thomas understood, not through thought, but through instinct. This was not an accident. This was not a random encounter on an empty road. She was waiting. The realization settled into him with a quiet certainty that felt both foreign and familiar, like a memory he had forgotten he still carried. He reached for the door handle, his movements slow, deliberate, as if giving himself one last chance to reconsider. But he did not stop. The door opened against the force of the wind, the cold hitting him immediately, sharp and unrelenting. And as he stepped out onto the snow-covered road, his boots sinking slightly beneath his weight, he kept his eyes on the dog, watching for any sign of aggression, any shift that might signal danger. But she did not move toward him, did not bare her teeth or raise her voice. She simply stood there waiting. And as Thomas took a few careful steps forward, the distance between them closing inch by inch, he felt something change within himself. Something subtle but undeniable, a shift away from the emptiness he had grown used to, towards something he could not yet name. And then, just as he came within reach, the dog turned fully, her body angling away from the road, and without a sound, without hesitation, she began to move, not running, not fleeing, but walking with purpose into the snow beyond the highway, pausing only once to look back at him, her gaze steady, expectant, as if asking a question she could not speak. And Thomas stood there for a fraction of a second, the wind pressing against him, the world around him reduced to white and silence, and in that moment he understood that this was the point at which everything could remain the same, or begin to change. And without fully realizing why, he chose to follow. The wind did not ease as Thomas Reed stepped off the highway and followed the German Shepherd into the untouched snow beyond the roadside, the world behind him fading into a blur of white and muted sound, his boots sinking deeper with each step as the storm wrapped around him like a living thing, pressing cold through the seams of his jacket and into his bones. Yet he did not stop. The dog moved ahead with quiet urgency, her body low but controlled, not panicked in the way lost animals often were, but purposeful, as if every step had already been decided long before he arrived, and that alone kept Thomas moving, his breathing steady but heavier now, visible in the freezing air, his senses sharpening in a way they had not in years, instinct rising where routine had once dulled everything. He watched her closely, noting the subtle stiffness in her gait, the slight hesitation in her left hind leg, a sign not of weakness but of strain, as though she had been moving for far too long without rest, and when she stopped, it was abrupt, her body turning sideways just enough to reveal what she had been leading him toward. At first, Thomas did not see it. The snow had nearly swallowed it whole, a shape uneven and low against the ground, partially hidden beneath a drift, and only when he stepped closer did the outline sharpen into something unmistakable. A cardboard box, worn and collapsing at the edges, its surface darkened by moisture and frozen patches, one side torn open just enough to expose what lay inside. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest as he crouched down, the cold biting harder now that he was still, his gloved hands brushing away the top layer of snow with careful, deliberate movements. And then he saw them, two small bodies pressed tightly together, barely distinguishable beneath the frost that clung to their fur. German shepherd puppies, no more than a few weeks old, their ears still soft and folded, their breathing so faint it almost escaped notice. One of them shifted slightly, a weak, involuntary movement that confirmed what his eyes struggled to accept. They were still alive, but only just. Thomas exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that carried with it something deeper than shock, something closer to recognition, not of the scene itself, but of the feeling it brought. The memory surfaced without warning, sharp and immediate. A training field years ago, the desert heat instead of snow, a K9 unit handler kneeling beside a wounded dog, explaining in a calm, steady voice how animals communicated distress, not through chaos, but through focus, how a trained dog would seek out the one person most likely to understand, how it would hold its ground not out of defiance, but out of trust. And as Thomas looked at the mother now standing just a few feet away, her eyes fixed on him, her body tense but unmoving, he understood that same principle was at work here. This was not a random act, not a coincidence born of chance. She had chosen him, not because he was special, but because something in the way he carried himself, the way he slowed, the way he looked, had told her he might listen. The realization settled into him with a quiet weight, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not in hesitation, but in acceptance. When he opened them again, his movements changed. No longer cautious in the sense of uncertainty, but precise, deliberate. He reached toward the box, his hands steady despite the cold, and as his fingers neared the puppies, the mother dog reacted. A sharp intake of breath, a subtle shift forward, not an attack, but a warning. Thomas paused immediately, his body stilling in response, his gaze lifting to meet hers, and in that silent exchange, something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but understanding. He did not rush, did not force the moment. Instead, he lowered his hand slightly, palm open, non-threatening, the same way he had been taught years ago when approaching animals under stress. The wind howled around them, but in that small space between man and animal, there was a strange stillness, a pause in which neither moved. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dog stepped back, just half a step, enough to create space, enough to say what she could not voice. Thomas felt the shift instantly, and without breaking eye contact he moved again, this time lifting one of the puppies gently from the box, its body light, too light. Its warmth barely there, he cradled it carefully, bringing it closer to his chest, shielding it from the wind. The second puppy let out a faint, fragile sound, a weak whimper that cut through the storm like something far more powerful than its size suggested. Thomas glanced back at the box, his mind already moving ahead, calculating what needed to be done, how much time they had, how far the truck was, and whether it would be enough. Behind him, the mother dog remained still, watching, her ears slightly lowered, her posture no longer rigid but not relaxed either. She was waiting, not for permission, but for proof. And Thomas understood that better than he could explain. He had lived his life on proof, on actions that carried meaning beyond words. And now, standing there in the snow with a life in his hands, he felt something shift inside him, something he had not allowed himself to feel since Margaret was gone. A sense of responsibility that extended beyond survival, beyond routine, something that demanded he act, not because he had to, but because he could not walk away. He reached back into the box for the second puppy. His movements quicker now, urgency replacing hesitation, and as he gathered both small bodies against him, turning slightly toward the direction of the road, he spoke for the first time, his voice low, steady, carried away almost immediately by the wind. "I've got them," he said. Not to himself, not entirely, but to the dog who had brought him here, and as if understanding, she shifted again, this time stepping fully aside, clearing the path behind him. Thomas rose carefully, adjusting his hold to keep the puppies close, his body instinctively shielding them from the storm, and as he took his first step back toward the highway, he felt her presence behind him, not leading now, but following, close enough to watch, far enough to remain ready. And in that quiet reversal, Thomas knew that whatever came next, he was no longer alone in it. The storm felt harsher when Thomas Reed pushed back toward the highway, the wind striking his face in sharp, unforgiving bursts as he carried the two fragile German Shepherd puppies against his chest, their bodies so light they barely registered as weight, yet heavy with the urgency of time slipping away. His boots struggled for traction in the deepening snow, each step slower than the last, but his movements remained controlled, purposeful, driven by something far stronger than physical endurance. Behind him, the mother dog followed without hesitation, her presence silent but constant, her dark form cutting through the white like a shadow that refused to disappear. Thomas reached the truck with a steadiness that masked the rising pressure inside him, his breath uneven now, not from exhaustion alone, but from the awareness that whatever he did next would determine whether the small lives in his arms continued or ended. He opened the passenger door quickly, shielding the puppies from the wind as he climbed inside, the sudden barrier against the storm creating a fragile pocket of warmth that felt almost unreal compared to the chaos outside. He placed the puppies carefully on the seat, pulling off his gloves with stiff fingers as he adjusted his jacket to wrap around them, his hands moving with practiced precision despite the cold. Numbing his touch, he checked their breathing again, leaning close enough to feel the faintest movement. One of them, the slightly larger one, showed shallow but consistent breaths, while the smaller one lay almost still, its chest barely rising, its body limp in a way that made something tighten sharply in Thomas's chest. He had seen this before, not in snow, but in places where survival depended on seconds, where hesitation cost lives, and in those moments, training had always taken over. Now, that same instinct returned, quiet but firm. He reached for his phone, his fingers slower than he wanted, the cold making even simple movements deliberate. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he had not used in months, Doctor. Emily Carter. She was a veterinarian in a small clinic about 30 minutes from his cabin, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp green eyes and auburn hair, usually tied back in a loose, practical knot, her posture straight, her voice calm in a way that suggested both confidence and patience. She had moved to the area years ago after leaving a larger city practice, choosing a quieter life where she could focus on the animals rather than the business around them. Thomas had met her once when a neighbor needed help, and what stayed with him was not just her skill, but the way she approached fear. Steady, grounded, never rushing, but never hesitating. He pressed call, holding the phone close as the line rang. Outside, the mother dog appeared at the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stood on her hind legs briefly, trying to see inside, her eyes searching. Thomas glanced at her, then back at the puppies. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, not as a command, but as a plea. The line connected, and Emily's voice came through, slightly muffled but clear enough. "Dr. Carter," she said, her tone alert but composed. Thomas did not waste time. 2 German Shepherd puppies. Hypothermia. Maybe worse, he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that revealed more than he intended. There was a brief pause, the kind that signaled immediate focus. "Are they breathing?" she asked, already shifting into assessment mode. "Barely," Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on the smaller one. "One's weaker." Emily's tone sharpened slightly, not in panic, but in urgency. "You need to warm them slowly, not fast, wrap them, body heat if you can, no direct heat, and keep checking their breathing. Don't let them go cold again." Thomas nodded instinctively, though she could not see him, his mind already translating her words into action. He adjusted his position, pulling the puppies closer against his chest. his body forming a barrier between them and the lingering cold. The larger puppy shifted slightly, a small movement that reassured him just enough to keep going, but the smaller one remained still, its silence louder than anything else in the truck. "Stay on the line," Emily added. "I'll guide you." Thomas exhaled slowly, grounding himself in her voice, and as he did, a memory surfaced, unbidden but vivid. A dusty field, the sound of gunfire in the distance, and beside him, a military dog named Ranger, a large, disciplined animal with sharp eyes and unwavering focus. Ranger had once taken the impact meant for Thomas, a moment that had split his life into before and after. He had not allowed himself to dwell on it in years. But now, holding these fragile lives, the memory did not feel distant. It felt present, as if the same thread of responsibility had never truly broken. Outside, the mother dog lowered herself beside the truck, her body pressed against the door, not trying to force her way in, but staying as close as possible. Thomas noticed the way she watched him, not with fear now, but with something else, something closer to trust, fragile but growing. And that trust carried weight. He could not fail it. He adjusted the puppies again, checking the smaller one's chest with careful attention. Seconds stretched, each one carrying more tension than the last, and then, barely perceptible, the smallest movement occurred. A faint twitch, a shallow breath that was almost nothing, and yet everything at once. Thomas froze for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing as he focused entirely on that tiny sign of life. "It moved," he said quietly into the phone, his voice lower now, more controlled. Emily responded immediately. "That's good. That means there's still a chance. Keep them warm. Keep them close." Thomas did not respond, not because he disagreed, but because he no longer needed confirmation. He already knew what he had to do. He shifted his grip slightly, ensuring both puppies were secure, and for the first time since stepping off the road, he allowed himself to think beyond the moment, beyond survival, toward what came next. He glanced once more at the mother dog outside, her head lifting slightly as if sensing the change inside him, and in that quiet exchange, something settled into place. This was no longer an interruption in his day, no longer a moment he could walk away from. This was a decision, and he had already made it. He reached forward, turning the key in the ignition, the engine responding with a low, steady rumble. And as the truck came to life, Thomas Reed, a man who had spent years moving without purpose, found himself moving again, this time not out of habit, but out of choice, carrying with him not just two fragile lives, but the beginning of something he had thought was long gone. The truck cut through the storm with a steady persistence that felt almost fragile against the weight of the wind, its headlights barely reaching beyond the curtain of snow as Thomas Reed drove toward the cabin he had not truly called a home in years, his hands firm on the wheel while his attention remained divided between the road and the two small bodies pressed against him, wrapped tightly inside his jacket, their warmth still uncertain but no longer fading. The engine's low hum created a rhythm that grounded him, a contrast to the chaos outside and behind the truck. Through the shifting blur of white, the mother dog followed, her silhouette appearing and disappearing with each gust, never falling too far behind, as if guided not by sight alone, but by something deeper, something that refused to let her lose the only thread she had left. When Thomas finally turned onto the narrow path leading to his cabin, the tires struggled against the thickening snow, but he pushed forward, guided more by memory than visibility, until the outline of the structure emerged, small and weathered, its wooden frame dark against the endless white, a place that had once held warmth but had long since settled into silence. He parked as close as possible, cutting the engine but leaving the lights on, not for himself, but for the dog outside, a signal that he had not disappeared, that he had not abandoned what he had started. He stepped out carefully, shielding the puppies again, And this time, the mother dog did not hesitate. She approached closer, her body tense but not resisting, her eyes tracking every movement he made, as if memorizing them, measuring them. He opened the cabin door with his shoulder, the interior greeting him with a stillness that felt different now, not empty, but waiting. He moved quickly, placing the puppies on a thick blanket near the small wood stove, his hands already working to bring life back into the space. He crouched down and began building a fire, the motions automatic, practiced from years of necessity but now carrying a sense of urgency that sharpened every movement. The flame caught slowly, then grew, casting a soft, flickering light that pushed back the cold inch by inch. He removed his jacket and wrapped it around the puppies again, checking their breathing as he had done before. Max, the stronger one, showed clearer signs now, his chest rising with more consistency, while Lily remained fragile, her breaths shallow, her body still too cold. Thomas reached for a small bottle, filling it with warm water, testing the temperature carefully before placing it near them, creating a gentle source of heat, controlled, steady, exactly as Emily had instructed. The door creaked slightly behind him, and when he turned, the mother dog stood at the threshold, snow clinging to her fur, her body trembling slightly from the cold but held together by sheer will. Thomas watched her for a moment, then stepped aside without speaking, giving her space to enter. She moved slowly, cautiously, her eyes scanning the room before settling on the puppies. She approached them with a careful urgency, lowering her head to check them, her nose brushing lightly against their bodies, a soft, almost inaudible sound escaping her as if she needed to confirm what she could not trust yet. Thomas remained still, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. And in that silence something shifted again, the distance between them narrowing not through force, but through shared purpose. Time passed in a way that felt both slow and compressed, measured not in minutes but in breaths. In small movements that carried meaning far beyond their size, Thomas adjusted the fire, checked the puppies again, and repeated the process without pause, the repetition grounding him, anchoring him in something tangible. And then there was a knock at the door, sharp but not urgent, a sound that seemed out of place in the middle of the storm. Thomas frowned slightly, rising to his feet and opening it just enough to see who stood outside. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks was wrapped in a heavy wool coat, her silver hair tucked beneath a knitted hat, her posture slightly bent with age, but her eyes bright and alert. She was in her early 70s, a woman who had lived in the neighboring property for decades, known for her quiet kindness and her stubborn independence. Her face lined with years of experience but softened by a warmth that never quite faded. She carried a small basket covered with a cloth, and without waiting for an invitation, she stepped inside, brushing snow from her shoulders as she did. "I saw your lights," she said, her voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that suggested she had already decided she was needed. Her gaze quickly found the puppies, then the dog, and finally Thomas, taking in the entire situation in a matter of seconds. "You've got your hands full," she added, not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact. Thomas nodded once, stepping aside to let her move closer. Eleanor knelt carefully beside the blanket, setting the basket down and uncovering it to reveal clean cloths, a small thermos, and a folded towel. "Warm milk substitute," she said, gesturing toward the thermos. "Used it years ago for a litter we found out back." Her movements were slower than Thomas's, but no less certain. Her hands steady as she poured a small amount into a lid, testing it the same way he had tested the water, then offering it carefully to Max first. Watching his response, when he reacted, weak but present, she allowed herself a small nod. "This one will make it," she said quietly. Then her attention shifted to Lily, her expression tightening just slightly, not with doubt, but with determination. "And this one," she added, softer now, "will need more than luck." Thomas watched her work, something unfamiliar settling into his chest, not the tension of responsibility, but something closer to relief, not because the situation had changed, but because he was no longer carrying it alone. Eleanor moved with a quiet confidence that filled the room in a way the fire alone could not. And as the hours passed, the cabin began to feel different. The silence replaced by the soft sounds of life returning, the crackle of fire, the faint movements of the puppies, the occasional low breath from the mother dog, who now lay closer than before. Her body no longer pressed toward the door, but angled slightly toward Thomas, as if her position had shifted from observation to presence, and then, without warning, as Thomas reached down to adjust the blanket, Bella, as he would soon call her, lifted her head and moved forward, closing the small remaining distance between them, her nose touching his hand briefly, gently, not out of need, but out of choice, and in that simple, unguarded moment, Thomas Reed felt something inside him settle into place, something he had not allowed himself to feel for a very long time, trust, fragile and incomplete, but real, and it was enough. Morning arrived quietly over the cabin, the storm having softened into a slow, drifting snowfall that blanketed everything in a muted calm, and inside, the air felt warmer than it had in years, not just from the fire that still glowed faintly in the stove, but from the presence of life that had settled into the small wooden space. Thomas Reed sat at the edge of the couch, his posture slightly forward, his attention fixed on the blanket where the 2 German Shepherd puppies rested. Their breathing more stable now, though still fragile. Max had begun to move with small, uncertain energy, his head lifting occasionally before falling back down, while Lily remained quieter, her strength returning in increments too small to measure, but impossible to ignore. Beside them, Bella lay with her body curved protectively around the edge of the blanket, her eyes half open, not fully resting, but no longer consumed by the tension that had defined her the night before. Thomas studied her more closely now in the clearer light, noting the details he had not fully seen in the storm, the thickness of her coat, the strength in her build despite the exhaustion. And then, as she shifted slightly, he noticed something that made him pause, a faint indentation in the fur around her neck, subtle but distinct, the kind left by a collar worn over time. His expression tightened, not with alarm, but with recognition. This was not a stray, not in the way he had first assumed. He leaned forward carefully, his movements slow to avoid disturbing her, and as he gently parted the fur along her neck, he found what he had expected, a small area where the hair had been flattened and slightly worn, confirming what his instincts had already begun to suggest. Bella had belonged to someone, and not long ago the realization shifted the situation in a way Thomas could not ignore. Before he could process it further, the sound of tires crunching over snow outside reached him, followed by the faint closing of a car door. A moment later, there was a knock, firm but measured. Thomas rose, opening the door to find Dr. Emily Carter standing there, her auburn hair pulled back tightly, her green eyes alert and focused. She wore a dark winter coat and carried a compact medical bag, her posture straight despite the cold, giving the impression of someone who moved through the world with intention rather than hesitation. "I came as soon as I could," she said, stepping inside without waiting, her gaze immediately scanning the room, assessing the situation in a single sweep. When she reached the puppies, her demeanor shifted slightly, softer but no less precise. She knelt beside them, her hands steady as she checked their temperature, their breathing, the responsiveness of their small bodies. "They're stabilizing," she said after a moment, glancing briefly at Thomas, "but the smaller one is still at risk." Her tone was not discouraging but realistic. Grounded in experience, she worked methodically, administering small amounts of nourishment, adjusting their position, ensuring they remained warm without overheating. And as she did, Thomas spoke, his voice quieter now. "She had a collar," he said, nodding toward Bella. Emily's hands paused briefly before she turned her attention to the dog, her fingers moving gently along the same area Thomas had examined. "Then she likely has a microchip," she replied, her voice thoughtful. "Most registered dogs do." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small handheld scanner, passing it slowly over Bella's neck, the device emitting a faint beep as it detected the chip. Emily's expression sharpened slightly, not with surprise but with confirmation. "There it is," she said, making a note on a small pad. "I'll need to run the number through the registry." Thomas nodded, watching her as she stepped aside to make a call, her voice low but clear, as she provided the necessary details. The process took only a few minutes, but the silence that filled that time felt heavier than it should have. When Emily returned, her expression had changed, not dramatically, but enough for Thomas to notice. "She's registered," Emily said, her tone measured, "to a property about 20 miles from here owned by a family named Harper." Thomas frowned slightly, the name unfamiliar but the implication clear. "So she wasn't abandoned," he said, though the words felt uncertain even as he spoke them. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "Not exactly," she said, choosing her words carefully. "The registered owner, a woman named Helen Harper, passed away recently." Thomas felt something shift again, the pieces beginning to form a picture he did not yet fully understand. "And now?" he asked. Emily exhaled quietly. "Now the property belongs to her children," she said, "and if I had to guess, they may not have had the same attachment to the animals." Before Thomas could respond, Eleanor, who had been quietly preparing tea at the small kitchen counter, spoke up, her voice carrying a quiet certainty. "I've heard of them," she said, turning slightly, her lined face thoughtful. "Daniel and Claire Harper, they've been coming up more often since the woman passed, not exactly the kind of people who stay long, always in a hurry, always talking about selling." She paused, her gaze drifting briefly toward Bella. "And I remember someone saying they didn't want the dogs around." The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, one filled with understanding rather than uncertainty. Thomas looked at Bella, at the way she lay close to the puppies, her body still angled protectively, and then at the faint mark on her neck where a collar had once been, and in that moment the story no longer felt incomplete. It felt deliberate. She had not simply wandered onto the road. She had been left, whether out of convenience or indifference, and the weight of that realization settled heavily, not as anger, but as something deeper, something that refused to accept the idea that what had happened was acceptable. Thomas straightened slightly, his posture shifting in a way that Eleanor noticed immediately. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" she said quietly, not accusing but recognizing. Thomas did not answer right away, his gaze still on Bella, his thoughts moving beyond the cabin, beyond the immediate moment, towards something larger, something unresolved. "They left her," he said, finally, his voice calm but firm. "And they left them," he added, glancing at the puppies. Emily watched him closely, understanding the direction his mind was taking. "You don't have to get involved," she said, not as a warning, but as a reminder. Thomas nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth in her words, but not accepting the implication. He had spent years choosing not to get involved, choosing distance, choosing silence, and where had that left him? He looked around the cabin, at the fire, at Eleanor, at Emily, at Bella, and the two fragile lives that had somehow found their way into his care, and he realized that this was not about obligation, it was about choice. And for the first time in a long while, the choice felt clear. "I'm not letting this go," he said, his voice steady, carrying a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. "I'm going to find out exactly what happened." Eleanor nodded slowly, not surprised. Emily said nothing, but the slight tilt of her head suggested approval rather than concern, and Bella, though she did not understand the words, seemed to sense the shift, her eyes lifting briefly to meet Thomas's before settling again, as if acknowledging something that had already been decided. And in that moment, the path forward, uncertain as it was, no longer felt empty. It felt necessary. The road leading to the Harper estate curved through a stretch of land that felt deliberately removed from everything else. The snow here less disturbed, the silence heavier, as if even the world itself hesitated to approach. Thomas Reed drove slowly, his truck cutting a narrow path through the untouched white, his hand steady on the wheel but his mind focused on what waited ahead. Beside him, Bella sat upright, her posture alert but tense, her ears shifting at every unfamiliar sound, and though she had grown calmer over the past day, there was something different now, something unsettled in the way her eyes tracked the surroundings, as if memory had begun to return in fragments she could not escape. Thomas noticed it without needing explanation. Animals did not forget in the same way people did. They carried experience in their bodies, in instinct. And Bella's instincts were speaking clearly. The estate came into view gradually, a large property set back from the road, its structure imposing without warmth, tall windows dark against the pale landscape. The kind of place designed to impress rather than to comfort. Thomas parked at a distance, stepping out into the cold with a controlled breath, his movements measured, deliberate. He opened the passenger door, and Bella hesitated for a brief moment before stepping down, her paws touching the snow with caution, her body lowering slightly as she scanned the space, her confidence from the cabin replaced by a guarded awareness. The front door opened before Thomas could knock, and a man stepped out. Daniel Harper was in his early 40s, tall and sharply built, his features angular, his dark hair neatly styled, his clean-shaven face carrying an expression that hovered between impatience and calculation. He wore an expensive coat that looked more suited for display than for weather, and his posture suggested someone accustomed to control, someone who expected the world to align with his decisions rather than challenge them. Behind him stood Claire Harper, slightly younger, her blonde hair falling straight past her shoulders, her figure slim, her face composed in a way that seemed practiced, her eyes cool and observant, taking in Thomas and Bella with a quiet detachment that felt more unsettling than open hostility. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence stretching just long enough to establish distance, Daniel broke it first, his voice even, almost polite, but lacking warmth. "You must be the one who called," he said, glancing briefly at Bella before returning his gaze to Thomas. "Doctor Carter informed us." Thomas nodded once, stepping forward slightly, positioning himself just enough between Bella and the house, a subtle movement, but intentional. "She's yours," Daniel continued, his tone shifting slightly, not softer but more transactional. "We were wondering when she'd turn up." Bella reacted almost instantly, her body tightening, her head lowering, a faint step backward that did not go unnoticed by Thomas. Claire's gaze followed the movement, her lips pressing together briefly, not in concern, but in acknowledgement. "She shouldn't have been out there," Claire said, her voice smooth, controlled. "But these things happen." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest, not anger, not yet, but something close. "With 2 puppies in a box?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the question more than rhetorical. Daniel's expression did not change, but there was a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "We didn't know about the puppies," he replied, too quickly, too cleanly, as if the answer had been prepared before the question was even asked. Claire stepped forward slightly, her posture more engaged now. "Look," she said, her tone shifting toward something resembling reason. "We're in the process of selling this property. We don't have the capacity to deal with animals, especially not now." She paused, her gaze returning to Bella, then to Thomas. "But we're willing to compensate you for your trouble." Daniel reached into his coat, pulling out a wallet, the gesture smooth, practiced, as if it had solved problems countless times before. "Whatever it costs," he added, his voice firm, definitive, as though the matter had already been settled. Thomas did not move, did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched Bella, the way her body remained angled away from them, the way her eyes avoided direct contact, the way her breathing had shifted from calm to shallow, and in that moment, everything he needed to know was already there. He turned his gaze back to Daniel, his expression steady, unyielding. "She's not going back with you," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a clarity that left no space for negotiation. Daniel blinked once, as if recalibrating, his posture stiffening slightly. "That's not your decision," he replied, the edge in his tone no longer hidden. Claire's expression tightened, not in anger, but in calculation, as if reassessing the situation. "Legally," she began, but Thomas cut her off, not with force but with certainty. "Legally," he said, "you abandoned her." The words landed heavier than their volume suggested, and for the first time, there was a shift. Subtle, but real. Daniel's jaw tightened. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly, not because they were surprised, but because the conversation had moved outside the boundaries they preferred. Before either of them could respond, Thomas continued. "There's a record," he said, his tone measured. "And there's a will," he added, recalling what Emily had told him earlier that morning. Claire's reaction was immediate, a brief, almost imperceptible pause, but enough to confirm what he needed. "You don't know what you're talking about," Daniel said, but the confidence in his voice had thinned, just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. Thomas took a step forward, not aggressive, but firm. "I know enough," he replied, "and I know she's not a transaction." Behind him, Bella shifted again, this time pressing slightly closer to his leg, not hiding, but choosing proximity. A silent declaration that carried more weight than any argument. And Thomas felt it, not as pressure, but as confirmation. He looked once more at the house, at the cold structure that stood behind Daniel and Claire, and then back at them, and whatever hesitation might have existed before was gone, replaced by something steady, grounded, and absolute. "She doesn't belong to you anymore," he said, his voice calm, final, and without waiting for a response, he turned, guiding Bella back toward the truck, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he walked away, not rushing, not looking back, because, for the first time in a long while, he was not uncertain about the path he had chosen, and behind him, the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. The decision to return to the Harper property did not come from impulse, but from a quiet certainty that had settled into Thomas Reed's mind after he left, the kind of certainty that once guided him through missions where hesitation could cost lives, and now, as he drove back along the same road under a sky that had begun to darken again, he understood that what he was looking for was no longer just proof. It was something deeper, something that would turn what he knew into something undeniable. Beside him, Bella sat more alert than before, her posture rigid, her attention fixed on the shifting landscape outside, as if she could feel what was coming long before it arrived. The wind had begun to rise again, not yet a storm, but building, gathering strength in a way that felt inevitable. Thomas parked farther from the house this time, choosing caution over proximity, his instincts guiding him to avoid being seen. He stepped out, the cold biting harder now, sharper, carrying with it the warning of what was about to unfold. Bella followed closely, her movements quieter, more controlled, no longer uncertain but deliberate, as if she understood the importance of what they were doing. The property felt different now, not just cold but tense, as though it held something it was not meant to reveal. Thomas moved along the side of the building, his steps careful, his eyes scanning for anything out of place, any sign that could confirm what he already suspected. The back structure, a detached storage building, caught his attention, its door slightly ajar despite the wind, and as he approached, the air seemed to shift, heavier, carrying a faint scent that did not belong to snow or wood. Inside, the space was dim, the light from the outside barely reaching in, and what he saw there stopped him, not with shock, but with a quiet, controlled anger. There were signs of neglect, broken crates, old bedding, traces of what had once been a place for animals, now abandoned, and among them, a discarded collar, partially buried beneath debris. Thomas stepped closer, picking it up, his gloved hand brushing away the dirt, the tag attached to it worn but still legible enough to confirm what he already knew. Bella's original collar, left behind like something no longer needed. His jaw tightened, not in reaction, but in resolve. He turned slightly, scanning the rest of the space, and then he heard it, a deep crack, sharp and sudden, followed by the unmistakable shift of weight above him. His body reacted before thought could catch up, stepping back but not fast enough. Part of the roof gave way under the pressure of the accumulating snow, wood splintering, collapsing downward with a force that left no room for escape. The impact drove him to the ground, a sharp pain shooting through his leg as debris pinned him in place, the air forced from his lungs in a single controlled breath, and for a moment everything went silent except for the sound of his own heartbeat. Steady but louder than it should have been. Thomas did not panic. Panic had never been part of who he was, but he assessed quickly, efficiently his leg was trapped beneath a beam, the weight heavy enough to prevent movement but not crushing. Not immediately fatal, he tested his range. Small movements only, confirming what he already felt. He was stuck outside. The wind surged, the storm arriving fully now. The structure around him groaning under the strain. Snow pushing in through the broken roof, covering everything in a cold that felt deeper than before. And then, through the shifting blur, he saw Bella. She had moved back at the moment of collapse, avoiding the falling debris by instinct. And now she stood just beyond the broken edge, her body tense, her eyes fixed on him. Thomas met her gaze, his breathing controlled, his voice steady despite the situation. "Go," he said. The word simple, clear, carrying more meaning than its sound. Bella did not move at first, her body resisting the command, her instinct pulling her toward him, but Thomas held her gaze, repeating the word with quiet firmness. And something in his tone, something familiar, reached her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second longer, then turned, her body moving with sudden speed, disappearing into the storm. Thomas exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in acceptance. He knew what he had asked, and he knew what it meant. Time stretched again, the cold seeping deeper, his body conserving energy, his mind focused on staying present, not drifting, not allowing the weight of the situation to pull him away from control. At the cabin, Eleanor stood near the window, her hands wrapped around a mug she had long forgotten to drink from, her eyes scanning the road that had begun to disappear beneath the storm. She was not a woman prone to fear, but she understood patterns, and something about the timing, the way the weather had turned, the way Thomas had left, unsettled her. Emily stood nearby, her coat already on, her medical bag prepared, her expression focused but tight. "He should have been back by now," Eleanor said quietly, not as a complaint, but as a statement of fact. Emily nodded once, already reaching for the door. "Then we go to him," she replied, her voice calm but decisive. And as they stepped out into the storm, guided by nothing more than direction and determination, Bella emerged from the white, her body moving fast but controlled, her path direct. She did not bark wildly, did not circle. She approached, stopped, turned, then moved again, repeating the motion with a clarity that left no doubt. She was leading. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, recognition settling in instantly. "Follow her," she said, and without hesitation, they did. The storm pressing against them, but Bella cutting through it with unwavering focus, and when they reached the collapsed structure, Thomas was still conscious, still alert, his eyes lifting as they approached, not surprised, but acknowledging what had already become clear: help had come, and it had come because of her. As the debris was cleared, as the pressure lifted, and the cold began to release its hold, Thomas allowed himself a single moment, a quiet recognition that settled deeper than anything he had felt in years. The life he had chosen to save had chosen not to leave him behind. Spring did not arrive all at once in the quiet stretch of Colorado where Thomas Reed lived. It came slowly, almost carefully, as if the land itself needed time to remember what warmth felt like after months of silence. The snow began to retreat in uneven patches, revealing dark earth beneath, and the air, once sharp and relentless, softened into something that carried the faint promise of renewal, and on a morning when the sky finally opened into a clear, pale blue, Thomas sat on the wooden steps of his cabin, his posture relaxed in a way it had not been in years, his hands resting loosely on his knees as he watched the small yard in front of him, where life, fragile and persistent, had begun to take hold again. Beside him, Bella lay stretched out in the sunlight, her coat now clean and full, no longer dulled by frost and exhaustion, her body strong, her breathing steady, her eyes half closed, not from vigilance, but from comfort. And a few feet away, Lily moved across the grass with uncertain but determined steps, her legs still slightly unsteady but growing stronger with each passing day, her small ears beginning to lift, her curiosity pushing her forward despite the world still being new to her. Thomas followed her movement with a quiet attention, not out of worry, but out of something closer to appreciation. Each step she took felt like something earned, something that had not been guaranteed, and in that realization, there was a kind of gratitude he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. Behind him, the door opened with a soft creak, and Eleanor stepped out, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her face carrying the familiar lines of age, but softened by the calm satisfaction of someone who had watched something broken begin to heal. She carried a small tray with 2 mugs, setting one beside Thomas without a word, her presence no longer an interruption, but a constant, something that belonged as naturally as the cabin itself. "She's stronger today," Eleanor said after a moment, her gaze following Lily. Thomas nodded slightly. "She is," he replied, his voice quieter than it once had been but steadier. Eleanor took a seat beside him, her movements slower but deliberate, and for a while they sat in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence itself had changed. It was no longer empty. It was shared, and that made all the difference. The legal process had taken weeks, but the outcome had been clear. With the evidence Thomas had gathered, the abandoned collar, the condition of the storage building, the testimony from Emily regarding the state of the puppies, and the record of the microchip, it had been enough to establish what had happened. Enough to show that Bella and her puppies had not been lost, but left, and under those circumstances the claim of ownership from Daniel and Claire Harper had not held, their interest in the matter fading quickly once it became clear that it would not resolve in their favor. Thomas had not sought confrontation beyond what was necessary, his focus never on punishment, but on protection, and in that he had found something that felt closer to purpose than anything he had experienced since leaving the life he once knew. Emily had been present through every step, her calm, measured approach grounding the process, her understanding of both the legal and the emotional aspects of the situation allowing her to navigate it with a clarity that Thomas respected. And over time, her visits to the cabin had become less about necessity and more about continuity, a connection that extended beyond the immediate crisis. She stepped out onto the porch now, her auburn hair loose for once, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested the absence of urgency. "I think Lily's ready for a proper checkup later," she said, leaning lightly against the railing. Thomas nodded, acknowledging without question, and as the 3 of them stood there, the sense of something shared, something built rather than inherited, settled quietly into place. Max had been the first to leave, not in a way that felt like loss, but in a way that felt right. A couple from a nearby town, Harold and June Whitaker, both in their late 70s, had come after hearing about the situation through Eleanor. Harold was a tall, thin man with a gentle stoop and a face marked by years of quiet work. His hands rough but careful, while June was small, her white hair neatly kept, her eyes warm and attentive. They had lost their last dog the previous year, and the absence had settled into their home in a way that felt too large to ignore. When they met Max, there had been no hesitation, no negotiation, just a quiet understanding that he belonged with them. Thomas had watched as they carried him away, not with regret, but with a sense of completion, knowing that Max would not just survive, but be cared for, truly cared for, and that mattered more than anything else. Lily, however, had never left. From the moment she had first opened her eyes fully, from the moment her small body had begun to respond to the world with curiosity instead of fear, there had been no question about where she would remain. She had chosen the cabin in the same way Bella had chosen Thomas, not through words, but through presence. And Thomas had not questioned it, had not resisted, because somewhere along the way, the idea of being alone had lost its meaning. It no longer felt like safety, it felt like absence, and that was something he no longer needed. Bella shifted beside him, her head lifting slightly before resting against his leg. The contact simple but intentional, and Thomas placed his hand gently against her side. The movement natural, unforced, as if it had always been there. The past did not disappear. Margaret was still part of him. The life he had lived did not vanish, but it no longer defined the limits of what came next. It existed alongside something new, something that had not replaced what he lost, but had grown around it, giving it space to exist without closing everything else off. Lily stumbled briefly as she crossed a patch of uneven ground, then steadied herself, continuing forward with the same quiet determination that had carried her through the cold. And Thomas watched her with a faint smile, not broad, not dramatic, but real, the kind that came without effort. And as the morning settled fully into place, as the light spread across the yard and the world seemed, for the first time in a long while, open rather than distant, Thomas Reed understood something that did not need to be spoken aloud, something that had been building since the moment he stepped out of his truck into the storm. He had believed he was the one who had stopped, the one who had chosen to act. But now, sitting there with Bella at his side and Lily moving through the sunlight, he saw it clearly, the truth that had been there from the beginning. He had not saved them, not in the way he once would have defined it. They had found him, they had led him, and in doing so, they had given him something he thought was gone, not purpose in the way he once understood it, but something quieter, something stronger, a reason to remain, and that was enough. Sometimes, the miracles we pray for do not arrive as light in the sky or voices in the dark, but as quiet moments placed gently in our path, waiting for us to notice them. That day on the frozen highway was not an accident. It was a moment chosen, a life crossing another life at exactly the right time. Thomas believed he was the one who stopped to save them, but in truth, it was God who guided him there, and through those fragile lives gave him something he had lost, a reason to keep going, a reason to feel again. In our own lives, we often pass by the small signs, the quiet calls for help, thinking they do not belong to us, but sometimes those moments are not interruptions, they are invitations. Invitations to show kindness, to choose compassion, to become part of something greater than ourselves. And when we answer them, we may discover that we are the ones being healed. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share where you are watching from and what you believe was the turning point in this story. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that hope still exists. And if you have not yet, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss more stories like this. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your path, just as he quietly guided Thomas on that snowy road.